Welcome back to DuctTales. You guys ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to nerd out about breastfeeding.
Me too. So last time, we got started with Dr. Jack Newman's What Doctors Don't Know About Breastfeeding, right? And we were talking about how knowledge is power when it comes to this whole breastfeeding thing.
Yeah, like understanding how it all works can really make a difference.
For sure. This time, we're taking a look at Chapter 1.
A short history of infant feeding. Such a great chapter.
It is. But you know what's crazy? Like you'd think breastfeeding being, the biological norm and all, would have been smooth sailing throughout history. But that's not the case at all.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of twists and turns in how we've fed babies over time. And honestly, some of the choices that were made, not exactly in the best interest of babies, or mothers for that matter.
That's what we're going to uncover today. All the ways breastfeeding has been low-key undermined throughout history. It's actually kind of wild.
It really is. So, ready to go way back in time.
Let's do it. Back to the hunter-gatherer days.
All right, picture this. No supermarkets, no formula aisles, no Amazon Prime delivering baby stuff to your doorstep.
Seriously, not even farms or agriculture? Back then, breastfeeding wasn't a choice. It was straight-up survival.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it, right? No cows to milk, no easy alternatives.
You had to breastfeed. No way around it.
And this really highlights how deeply ingrained breastfeeding was in those cultures.
Totally. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
The book talks about this anthropological finding of shared breastfeeding.
Oh, yeah, where other mothers in the community would nurse a baby if needed.
Talk about a supportive village. It's amazing to think about.
Makes you wonder what we've lost along the way, right?
Right.
We stress so much about breastfeeding now.
I know, it's become this big, complicated thing,
Totally. Okay, so breastfeeding was a given in these early communities, right? But then history throws us a curveball.
Wet nursing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hiring another woman to breastfeed your baby.
Okay, so that was a thing across different cultures and time periods.
Yeah, it's a whole complex practice, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes by choice. But often, it involves some level of exploitation. Like you had these poor women who were separated from their own babies to nurse the babies of wealthier families.
Oh, that's so sad. The book actually describes this painting of a child clinging to their wet nurse, super distressed to be back in their biological mother's arms.
Oh, wow.
It's heartbreaking, but also really makes you think about the bonds that form between them.
Yeah, those emotional connections were real.
All right, fast forward a bunch of centuries.
Mm-hmm.
We hit industrialization, and you'd think things would advance, right? Like progress. But actually, when it came to breastfeeding, things took a step back.
It is ironic, isn't it? Scientific thinking led to progress in so many areas. But with infant feeding, it was like they wanted to control and overthink everything.
Oh, totally. Doctors started pushing for faked feeding schedules. Forget the baby's cues, just stick to the clock.
Exactly. And guess what? It messed with the natural rhythm of breastfeeding.
Makes sense. Babies don't run on a clock.
Yep. And all this focus on the clock, it often led to mothers supplementing with formula unnecessarily.
Ugh, it's so frustrating. We're only just now rediscovering the whole intuitive, responsive feeding thing.
Right. It's like we're circling back to what our ancestors already knew. But the book, it even has this quote about the advice mothers were given back then. It says, feed the baby 10 minutes on each breast every 3 hours.
Oh, I remember that. 10 minutes. Really?
Yeah, that was the scientific advice.
Wild.
But let's not forget another big development during this time, commercial infant formula.
It was marketed as this superior scientific choice.
Ah, yes. The irony. Looking back, it's kind of hard to believe how much emphasis they put on that scientific angle.
The book has this quote from a formula ad in the 1890s. Get this. It claimed to be the only sterilized milk identical to that of a woman.
Identical.
Right. We know now that breast milk is so complex and unique, formula can't even come close.
Nope. Not even close. But back then, they didn't fully grasp all the amazing benefits of breast milk.
So formula companies, they kind of took advantage of that.
They definitely capitalized on parents' anxieties. Are you feeding your baby enough? Is your baby getting all the nutrients they need?
And all this just further eroded trust in breastfeeding. It's so sneaky.
It really is. And they didn't just stick to advertising. Oh, no. Formula companies, they created these elaborate booklets.
Oh, yeah, I remember those. They were filled with images and advice that often portrayed breastfeeding in a negative light.
Totally. There was one booklet with a section called, get this, Feeding Problems Fixed. and the pictures. They heavily implied that breastfeeding was the problem and formula was the solution.
Oof, talk about misinformation.
It's a classic example of how those kinds of messages can really shape perceptions.
And undermine something as natural as breastfeeding.
Exactly. So with formula being pushed as the scientific choice and all, what happened to breastfeeding? Did it just fade away?
Well, bottle feeding basically became so ingrained in society it was everywhere.
Yeah, it really did. And it influenced everything. Parenting advice, baby toys, children's books, you name it.
Think about it. How many times do you see a baby being breastfed in a children's book?
Yeah, it's usually a bottle, right? Like even from a young age, we're conditioned to see bottle feeding as the norm.
It's crazy. The book mentions this anecdote about a postcard from Swaziland where breastfeeding is so normal, it's not even mentioned in the caption.
What does it say?
It just says, a woman weaving a basket. That's it.
Wow, that's incredible.
I know. Like, it's so embedded in their culture, it doesn't even need to be pointed out.
It makes you think, right? Like, why is breastfeeding treated as unusual or even, taboo in so many Western cultures?
I know. It's kind of a bummer.
It is. It's a reminder that our cultural norms can have a huge influence on our perceptions, whether we realize it or not.
So true. And these biases, they're often subtle, operating under the surface.
Exactly. Like, think about the language we use, right?
Oh, yeah. Like, how often do we hear breastfeeding called weird or inappropriate in public?
Yeah, or there's pressure to cover up or go to some designated breastfeeding area as if it's something to be ashamed of.
It's like society wants to pretend that babies don't need to eat.
Right. Or that breastfeeding is somehow this radical act when it's the most natural thing in the world.
And what about the lack of support in workplaces? So many moms are forced to choose between their careers and breastfeeding.
Yeah, because their employers don't offer enough support, like adequate pumping breaks or a dedicated space.
It's a huge barrier. It's like breastfeeding is seen as a personal choice that shouldn't interfere with real work.
Exactly. And then there's the constant marketing for formula and all those other baby products. It's everywhere.
Ugh, seriously. And those ads. They often prey on parents' insecurities, making them question their ability to breastfeed.
They make it seem like formula is the easier, more convenient option, and that's just not always the case.
It's a good reminder that we need to be careful about what we believe, especially when it comes to how we feed our babies.
Absolutely. And we need more public health campaigns that actually normalize and promote breastfeeding. We need to counter all that formula marketing with accurate information.
I agree. Like, we need to shift the whole narrative.
Totally.
It's not just about individual choices. It's about creating a society that values and supports breastfeeding.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And it starts with all of us,
Yeah, like having those conversations, even when they're a little uncomfortable, and pushing for better policies and supporting organizations that promote breastfeeding.
You got it. And it's not about shaming anyone for their choices, okay?
Oh, definitely not.
It's about creating a world where all families feel empowered to make informed decisions about how they feed their babies without judgment or pressure.
So well said. I think that's a perfect place to stop for part 1 of our deep dives into the history of infant feeding.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground there.
We did. We learned about how breastfeeding has been undermined throughout history. And next time, we're going to zero in on a place where, you'd expect more support.
The medical community.
You got it.
Buckle up, guys, because it might surprise you to learn that even doctors haven't always been equipped with the knowledge and training to properly support breastfeeding mothers.
We'll be back soon to uncover the historical forces that shaped medical education and how they've impacted breastfeeding support. Stay tuned.
It's funny, right? You'd think doctors with all their medical training would be like the biggest supporters of breastfeeding.
Right. Like, you'd think they'd be all about it.
But it's a little more complicated than that,
So
unfortunately.
you're saying even medical professionals, they haven't been immune to all those historical biases and, like, the misinformation we talked about.
Exactly. You see, medical education, especially back in the early 20th century, it was very focused on formula feeding. They were really into the whole science of it. And sometimes they kind of overlooked the nuances of breastfeeding.
But they recognized the nutritional value of breast milk, though, right? They weren't totally in the dark.
Oh, for sure. They knew breast milk had important nutrients. But the thinking was that formula, it could be, like, engineered to be just as good as breast milk. or even better. So they didn't always emphasize the unique benefits of breastfeeding, like the immune factors and all that.
So they're trying to outdo nature with science.
Totally. They were so focused on creating this like perfectly controlled feeding method that they missed the biological connection between a mother and baby that makes breastfeeding so powerful.
So what did all this mean for new mothers back then? Like, they go to their doctor for advice on breastfeeding. What happened?
Okay, so picture this. A new mom, totally exhausted, maybe a little overwhelmed.
Totally.
And she turns to her doctor for help with breastfeeding, right?
Makes sense.
But instead of getting practical advice and support, she's given a rigid feeding schedule and told to supplement with formula if the baby cries or seems fussy.
Oh, no, that's awful. It's like setting those mothers up to fail.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. And the advice they were getting, it perpetuated the cycle of like doubting themselves and not trusting their bodies.
But things have changed since then, right? I mean, doctors today, they're more aware of the benefits of breastfeeding.
Yes, definitely. There's been a lot of progress, but, and this is a big but, there are still gaps in medical training when it comes to breastfeeding. Like a study in 2022 showed that a lot of medical schools only dedicate less than 20 hours to breastfeeding education during their entire program.
Wait, 20 hours for their whole medical training?
Yeah, it's not a lot considering how important breastfeeding is for infant health.
That's crazy. So does that mean doctors today, they're not equipped to help moms who want to breastfeed?
Not necessarily. I mean, doctors can still be a valuable resource for breastfeeding families.
Okay.
But it's important for parents to know that their doctor might not have all the answers when it comes to breastfeeding.
So what should parents do then? Where can they find good, reliable information and support?
Oh, there are so many great resources out there. Like, there are certified lactation consultants, La Lush League groups.
Yeah, I've heard of those.
And even like online communities can be really helpful. These resources, they really focus on breastfeeding, so they can offer the kind of in-depth support that many doctors just haven't had the training to provide.
It sounds like finding the right community is key.
Absolutely. Breastfeeding doesn't have to be a solo journey.
For sure. This whole conversation, it just highlights how much we need to change the way we think about breastfeeding,
I know what I mean.
It's not just about like individual choices. It's about creating a culture where breastfeeding is like the norm, where it's supported and celebrated.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And it starts with education, awareness, and challenging those old biases we keep talking about.
Right. And it's about holding the medical community accountable too.
Oh, absolutely. Like, they need to step up and make sure their doctors are getting the proper training.
Because they're the ones parents turn to first.
Yeah, and if doctors are informed, then they can really help their patients make the best decisions for themselves and their babies.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It feels like we're just scratching the surface, though.
I know, right? There's so much more to explore.
Well, that's the thing about history.
What's that?
It's always unfolding, and we're always learning new things from it. But the more we understand how things got to be the way they are, the better we can make things for families today.
I love that. And that's what DuctTales is all about, right? Helping parents navigate the world of breastfeeding with confidence and knowledge.
And a little bit of humor along the way.
Exactly.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Even now, like in the 21st century, with all the information out there, breastfeeding still faces so many challenges.
It really does. It's like those historical forces we talked about. They still have this like ripple effect on how we view breastfeeding today.
Totally. It makes you wonder, like, what can we actually do to change things? How do we make breastfeeding feel more, normal and accepted?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's not an easy one to answer. There's no quick fix, unfortunately.
Okay, but there's got to be something we can do, right?
Of course. For one thing, we need to talk about it more, like openly and honestly. Normalize breastfeeding in our everyday conversations.
So, like, not shying away from it, not treating it like it's some kind of secret.
Exactly. We need to get comfortable talking about the ups and downs of breastfeeding, share our stories, offer support, and, maybe even educate those who still have those old-fashioned views.
It's like it takes a village, right? Maybe we need to rebuild that village of support for breastfeeding moms.
I love that. And it's not just about talking, it's about taking action too. Like, we need to push for better breastfeeding policies in workplaces, public spaces, everywhere.
Okay, so like advocating for paid parental leave, having dedicated lactation rooms in offices, making sure moms feel comfortable breastfeeding wherever they need to.
Yes, exactly. It's about creating environments where breastfeeding is seen as normal and natural, not as a burden or an inconvenience.
We also talked about those misleading marketing campaigns from formula companies. How do we combat that influence?
Well, we need to be really smart consumers of information. We got to educate ourselves about the benefits of breastfeeding and, really think critically about those marketing messages that try to make us doubt ourselves.
So, like, do your research, talk to trusted professionals like lactation consultants.
Exactly. And remember, you always have the right to make your own choices about how to feed your baby. Don't let anyone pressure you into something that doesn't feel right.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. I can't believe how much history still shapes how we see breastfeeding today.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? History isn't just about the past, it affects us right now, but we can learn from it, we can challenge it, and we can work towards a better future for breastfeeding families.
That's what DuctTales is all about, giving parents the knowledge and the confidence to navigate this crazy world of breastfeeding.
One chapter at a time.
That's right. And to all the parents out there on their own breastfeeding journey, remember, you're not alone. There's a whole community out there ready to support you every step of the way.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep trusting yourselves. You've got this.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of DuctTales. It's been such a great deep dive into Chapter 1 of what doctors don't know about breastfeeding. We learned about the history of infant feeding, how breastfeeding has been undermined, and most importantly, how we can start to change things for the better.
Yes, it's been an amazing conversation.
And we'll be back next time to dive into Chapter 2, Medical Education and Breastfeeding. We'll be uncovering the surprising gaps in medical training when it comes to breastfeeding and exploring ways to advocate for better support from our healthcare providers.
Can't wait. It's going to be fascinating.
Until then, happy feeding, everyone.